Hey monsters, thanks for tuning in to Murder Murder News, the true crime cult for the latest breaking news, murdery memes, TV reviews, podcast recommendations, and all things spooky. If social distancing has got you down, we want to invite you to join our spooky commune where we can all share our thoughts about our anxiety, the true crime shows we're watching, and maybe hold sanitized hands while we circle around baby goats. I'm television's Aurora Katie.
And I'm Angelina. Cults are no fun alone, so don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and tell all of your true crime friends. This is the Week in True Crime.
Murder, murder, news.
Last year, Linda Collins Smith, a 57-year-old businesswoman and former state senator, was found dead at her home in the small community of Pocahontas near Little Rock, Arkansas. Linda's son, Butch, and his grandfather discovered her body under a tarp in the driveway, unrecognizable as she had been stabbed several times and her body was in an advanced state of decomposition. Linda's longtime close friend and aide, Rebecca O'Donnell, was arrested and charged with her murder. Rebecca's fiancé, Tim Loggins, was flabbergasted. He said that Rebecca and Linda had been very close. "Becky's not capable of this. There's not a chance she did this," he said. O'Donnell's family also backed her up. The whole case has been shrouded in secrecy, but the general vibe has been, how dare they accuse this woman? And her family was perplexed when the state police called and asked the jail to place her on investigative status. She was not allowed any visits or phone calls or any contact with other prisoners. Meanwhile, O'Donnell maintained her innocence. Why were they doing this to Becky? Late last year, Judge John Fogelman took over the case after 3 previous judges withdrew due to possible conflicts of interest. Judge Fogelman announced in June of this year that he would be unsealing at least 51 documents filed by investigators and prosecutors in one of the strictest gag orders that the state of Arkansas has ever seen. Now we can finally piece together the mysterious case of Linda Collins Smith and Rebecca O'Donnell. Rebecca was arrested after surveillance footage showed her disabling the security cameras at Linda's home. Linda's son explained that O'Donnell had been caught stealing money from Linda and snapped when confronted. Rebecca was placed on administrative lockdown because of the violent nature of her alleged crimes. And in early 2020, some of her fellow inmates came forward with stories of Becky trying to hire them to kill Linda's husband, Phil Smith, and make it look like a suicide, with a note left at the scene that implicated him and his wife's murder and let Becky off the hook. Fellow inmates also described her plan to have them blow up her vehicle, which was being held at the jail, and any incriminating evidence inside of the vehicle, as well as some talk of murdering prosecutor Henry Boyce, who withdrew from the case last year. The prosecution had intended to push for the death penalty for Becky, but in a plea deal last week, she confessed to Judge John Fogelman, "I intentionally killed her and hid her body." Rebecca O'Donnell pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse related to her efforts to conceal the body. She pleaded no contest to 2 counts of solicitation to commit capital murder for conspiring with her fellow inmates. She will serve all of her sentences concurrently and should spend a total of 50 years in prison for her crimes. Linda Collins Smith's daughter said in a statement, "No amount of punishment will ever fill that void that Rebecca O'Donnell made in our lives the day she killed our mother. Today, we find some shred of peace that O'Donnell will be put away in prison for a very long time, unable to hurt anyone else."
Last Thursday, 37-year-old Melissa Banda was allegedly kidnapped in McAllen, Texas, after 3 witnesses reported seeing her estranged husband, Richard Ford, force her into an SUV. Police arrested Richard hours later and held him under suspicion of kidnapping. They then found Melissa's body in a car Richard had rented and abandoned an hour away on South Padre Island. Richard allegedly cut her throat with an unknown sharp object shortly after abducting her. On Tuesday, Richard was charged with capital murder, kidnapping, and sexual abuse. He had a history of domestic abuse against Melissa, and she had a protective order against him. As recently as June 30th, she had called to report a violation of this order. According to the Monitor, she obtained the emergency protective order against Richard on February 28th after he forced his way into her house, pulled her hair, smashed her face into a stone wall, and then covered her nose and mouth so she couldn't breathe. According to Melissa, the argument was related to the value of their home and their pending divorce. Richard left her home before the police arrived and went to pick the kids up from school, and the police found him with the children at a trampoline park. Melissa perceived this as a threat that he might harm her children or try to take them away from her, and she'd been living in fear of him ever since. Our hearts go out to Melissa's family, and we are linking to her GoFundMe below, which will help support her 3 children who will now be living their life without their mother because of disgusting toxic masculinity. In the US, 35% of women experience violence from an intimate partner, and that number is higher in marginalized groups. In fact, I know in true crime we're often afraid of being kidnapped or murdered by a serial killer, but 70% of women who are murdered each year are murdered by a partner. If you are experiencing domestic violence, we're including some resources down below for you to try to work on a safety plan that feels comfortable for you.
This week, we're watching the 2nd season of The Alienist on TNT. If you haven't watched the 1st season of Alienist yet, stop what you're doing and watch it now. The Alienist stars Dakota Fanning and Luke Evans and explores the concept of the emergence of forensic science and psychology in the late 1800s in New York City. Is it historically accurate? Probably not. But the costume and set designs are stunning, and the plot is riveting. This is a must-watch, and you can check it out on TNT or HBO Max.
Have you watched this yet, the 1st or 2nd season?
No, I haven't.
Okay, so I've been hearing stuff about it for the past year. I tried watching it once, like the 1st episode, and like it's pretty gory. Like one of the first scenes is this kid who's been murdered and his eyes are missing, and like it's quite graphic.
Yeah.
And which is not my style. So like I turned it off, like I gave up on it, but it keeps popping up in like Facebook groups and stuff I'm in. And like last week, I've been having some like chronic pain, and so I've been sort of in bed and not able to move around a lot. So I sat and watched both seasons in 3 days and regretted not a single minute of it.
Wow. So like at which point did you get hooked? Because I know like the 1st episode didn't do it for you, so hold on until about when?
Yeah, so it gets less graphic. Like I think a lot of shows when they first start, they want to hit you with like all the sex, all the violence, all of like, you know, just the wild whatever in the 1st episode.
Yeah.
And then they kind of tone it back, or they run out of money for special effects and visual effects and stuff. So it gets less graphic. I won't say it's completely gone as it goes on, but by the 2nd episode, it's just like, it's so beautiful. Dakota Fanning is just such a badass in it. Like she's just so lovely and talented, and her costumes are fantastic, and oh my god, it's so good.
Awesome.
We're so excited to have Celene Beth Calderon with us from this week's favorite podcast, The Chosen Ones. The Chosen Ones tells the story of the Ballo and Daybell families. Aside from hosting her podcast, Celene is also a documentary filmmaker who's in the process of releasing her film, Killing Theodore, which focuses on the victims, survivors, families, and communities impacted by Ted Bundy. Celene, we're so excited to have you here today. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me.
Awesome. Well, I would like to talk about your newest project, which is, of course, the podcast, The Chosen Ones, which talks about Lori Vallow's story. I was wondering, how did you first hear about her story, and what inspired you to tell this?
Yeah, so I live here in Salt Lake City, Utah. So a lot of the news that travels from Idaho or Colorado gets funneled into Utah pretty quickly. And seeing that this case also has a LDS or Latter-day Saints component, that basically heightens the stories that, again, get filtered through to our community. So I realistically heard about the case towards the end of September of 2019. So when JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan were officially, missing, we started getting updates, again, in our local community. And then that's when I started going down that rabbit hole a little bit. And at the time, not too much was provided. And then it seemed like within a week, it was all this information about these other individuals who were involved. And I just kept on top of it. So from September to now, but I really started to feel uncomfortable towards springtime, even though it was still a topic of conversation. I really, really was concerned about these children, especially JJ, because JJ's was on the autism spectrum, and I have a family member who is also on the spectrum. So just that alone was tugging at my heartstrings. So I was approached by Conveyor Media about starting a podcast during this time in quarantine. And my usual other go-to case is Susan Powell, but the wonderful Dave Crawley just did the Cold podcast, so we got that one there. Dave's
Right.
wonderful. And so I kind of threw out the idea, well, maybe we can look at the Vallow Daybell case, even though this is current and breaking and ongoing. And but they were like, let's do it. Let's jump on it. See what you can do with it. So honestly, it took me about a month and a half to develop, to even get, the initial concept going. But once we made the announcement that we were going to be doing this podcast, no joke, I think it was like a week or two later, the children were found. So
Right.
I still felt determined to do this story and give it the proper treatment specifically for the victims. That's something that I always talk about, obviously, with Killing Theodore, which is a big component to that. So I wanted to make sure that I honored those victims first, and go through this case. But I mean, even so, I've been sitting in my home for the past few days watching these preliminary hearings for Chad Daybell and getting new information today and yesterday. So it's a lot, but it's informative, and I think it's very crucial, especially when we're talking about special needs and the abuse that they could go through. So.
Right. And, it's interesting, being from Salt Lake City, I've only been there once, sort of in passing, and it has this feeling of being sort of a sleepy town. There's not a lot of like bars and things, because there's sort of like the faux pas drinking, and it feels like very calm compared to all of the wild things that happen there. Like, what goes on in Salt Lake City?
So I grew up in Park City, Utah, which is 30 minutes, which is the home of the Sundance Film Festival. Our town is a little more, well, when I was growing up, was more on the liberal side. So we were kind of the outsiders. So when I moved to Salt Lake City, when I started going to school at the University of Utah, I wasn't familiar with the Mormon culture. I really had no idea. Honestly, where I live, more in the downtown area, it's actually really liberal, and we do have a lot more bars and whatnot. But as soon as you start getting more south, again, kind of where Tammy Daybell was from, as well as the Powell family,
Right.
that's where you're starting to see the that culture doesn't exist.
Right.
Church and state.
Right.
Church and state. But yeah, so it's an interesting place to live.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the disappearance of Tylee and JJ seemed like a nightmare from the very beginning. But as the story unfolded, as you mentioned before, it got more and more complicated. There is the doomsday cult. There's the death of the spouses of both of the partners. There's theories about where the children could have been, which unfortunately did not end up being true. And you've done such an incredible job of researching this very complicated timeline of these strange events in a coherent way. How did you go about piecing all of this together?
Oh man, it's hard. Because I mean, ultimately, kind of what I'm finding out, there's so many hearsays of, well, so-and-so met here and so here. I mean, the perfect example was even just yesterday with Melanie Gibbs sitting on the stand. Some of the things that I reported last week in our episode already changed,
Right.
from her story from Dateline. So ultimately, all of my news since I started hearing about the case came from Nate Eaton with East Idaho News. Because they're local, they're getting this information almost immediately. So that's kind of been my main source. But again, kind of going through sifting through the personal accounts of some of the family members, because they did make personal statements on their Facebook pages and whatnot. But also, you know, prior to, again, the children being found, I was in contact with some individuals pertaining to this case. So that all was shut down, obviously, as soon as the kids were found, because now, you know, we're in trial mode. So
Right.
ultimately, you know, I decided to make each episode about one or two individuals. Right now, we're sticking with one because the timeline is so complicated. And even when I started learning about the case, I couldn't keep track who was related to who was friends here. There's two Melanies, there's a new husband, ex-husbands, you know, not just from just Chad and Lori. I mean, it's convoluted. So ultimately, my writing partner, Jessica Barton, and I, we sat down right at the beginning and went through an actual timeline. And that's when I decided episode 1 was just going to be a timeline, just generic bullet points to get you up to speed. I didn't want to go into full detail of people just yet. But that's where that breakdown has been for the past 5 episodes. And then this week will be about Alex Cox. So hopefully I'm starting to hear people say, okay, I finally get it, because you're breaking it down in a way that I can follow. So luckily, you know, we're going to maintain that, but I hope by the end we're comfortable enough where we can start using, you know, the names a little more casually. But it is a difficult feat. I will not lie at all.
Yeah, you did great, because it really helped clarify for me who some of the different players were. And as you mentioned on your show, this had been going on for so much longer than September 2019 when the kids were missing. Like, people were dying before that. There's so much. And anytime I would try to read an article about this, it's like, wait, who's Tammy? Like, who's Alex? Like, what did these what do these people have to do with like the children missing? And it really helped clarify it for me.
Oh, thank you. It's good to hear.
So there's so many unknowns about what actually happened to Tylee and JJ, plus the mysterious deaths of Tammy Daybell, Chad's ex-wife, Charles Vallow, Lori's ex-husband, and Alex Cox, Lori's brother. Do you think there's any possibility of getting answers from Lori and Chad at any point? Will we ever really know what actually happened?
You know, I thought that was going to happen today. During the preliminary hearing for Chad, they did play an audio recording from Lori calling Chad the morning of them finding Tylee and JJ. And I actually reached out to Dave from Cold, because he's up there right now. And it was very hard to hear what they were saying. But almost the way that they're talking, specifically Chad, there's something there, because he knows he's in trouble. And I made out the words of something, they're going to find the kids, something to that extent. And Lori's just calmly saying, okay, but you can tell she's on the brink of tears. So I am very intrigued. Literally before we started too, they just had one of the FBI agents discussing text messages and what they have found. But I don't know if they're disclosing more of that information. So, you know, I think at this point, it's gonna have to be based on, you know, the evidence and the exhumation, you know, in regards to Tammy, medical examiner, forensics. But in terms of Chad and Lori speaking, you know, directly to their attorneys, or I don't think that's ever gonna happen. I can just tell by their demeanor, and they have, you know, this calculated notion that they're not going to reveal anything, because even the conversation that was revealed yesterday with Melanie Gibb, this 21-minute phone call, Lori is very calculated in what she's saying and how she's saying it. So they already figured that out of how they're going to keep that under wraps. I don't see them cracking. I really don't. And so I think it's just going to be based on evidence if that ever comes out.
Do you have any sense, and maybe this is something that's too far in the future to tell, what could their convictions be if they don't tell on each other, and if the evidence isn't conclusive enough to show that it was one of them or both of them that had something to do with the children's death? Is there any possibility of conviction of murder without them admitting to it?
That's my hope. I really have a feeling they are going to try to pin it on Alex Cox. That's kind of the impression I'm getting from John Pryor, who is Chad's attorney. So I'm hoping there's homicide charges and there's enough evidence to, put that on them. But yeah, I don't know. It's like, I keep going back to like the Manson murders, even though Charles Manson didn't have the knife, there's still that element of, no, this was calculated on behalf of everyone, regardless if, it was Alex Cox who executed all of these things. But they made an interesting point right now, just about an hour ago, saying, again, there's this text message that Chad sent his late wife, Tammy, that a raccoon was shot in the backyard. The timestamp of that correlates to when Tylee would have been killed. So again, do we know who pulled that trigger, if that's how she was murdered? Again, I really hope the FBI figures that out. But I'm crossing my fingers that this doesn't go into a situation where they get off easy and they're just, only getting the concealment charges and whatnot. So I don't know. Like I said, it's so hard to tell, but these preliminary hearings are pretty telling already. So.
Right. And Charles Manson is actually a strangely good comparison in this case. You're right. Like, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Well, what do you think Lori and Chad's reactions were waking up on July 23rd to the world not ending? Do you think there was any sense of reality check for them that perhaps they were wrong? Like, what's going through their minds?
Yeah. I mean, and that's, I think about it and it just makes me giggle a little bit. I pointed out that there are some weird thought processes about this, because Ian Pulaski, who was married to Melanie Pulaski, who was previously Melanie Boudreaux, he stated that Chad made a claim that before the end of the world, the Wasatch Front, which is, also part of here in Salt Lake City, that we would be hit with an earthquake, a 5.7 magnitude, leading up to, like I said, the end of the world. Well, that did happen in March of 2020.
Wow.
And actually a 5.7 magnitude earthquake. So that was kind of creepy, and then we have, just obviously what's going on around us with the coronavirus and, police brutality. And it just seems like our world is on fire almost. Right. So a part of me is wondering if that was more of, a way of them saying that was the end of the world. I don't know. Like, I can't figure it out, but with them talking about Harry Potter and like spells and creatures and how that all mixes in, I don't entirely know. Right. But I do know some of the ideologies behind Doomsday also does derive from the LDS religion. So there is some component to that. I've yet heard them say when that day was, but I'm sure they woke up that next morning and, kind of thought, okay, maybe we messed up on our numbers. I still think they think that it's going to happen. They miscalculated.
I think you're right. Like, there's some hope that they're feeling remorse, or that they're like, oh no, like it's July 23rd. Like, what did we just do? But I think you're right. I think it's probably just an assumption that like, oh, we were off by months or a year, or like some nonsensical explanation. But the earthquake prediction is creepy.
Is weird. Yeah. That's the one that gets me.
Yeah. So aside from your work on The Chosen Ones, we already mentioned that you're directing the documentary Killing Theodore. So these
Mhm.
projects seem very different from each other. For one thing, the way film goes, my husband works in film, so I have some sense of that, versus a podcast is very different. But also, Ted Bundy's story is in the past, it's so static. Lori Vallow's case still has so many unknowns and is still evolving. How has this process felt for you compared to the experience of directing the documentary?
Yeah, I mean, there's some parallels in terms of, storytelling as well as producing when you're, discussing this. But obviously, Ted Bundy is a household name at this point, especially within the last couple years.
Right.
Lori Vallow is a strong names, a lot more on the West Coast than it is on the East Coast. I do find myself having to explain the case a little bit more to my East Coast friends.
Interesting.
Yeah, so, but at the end of the day, really what it comes down to, having these conversations with people who are close to these cases, it all resonates the same. However, speaking to someone who is experiencing it live and in the moment carries a totally different representation as well as emotion. I did get a little weepy on some of the episodes already with The Chosen Ones, and it was a emotion that I wasn't expecting, and I really debated re-recording that without the emotion. But I thought, you know what, it's actually important because oftentimes we listen to these stories without any type of reaction. We consume true crime in a large capacity that we're almost immune to these stories and to the horrific details and whatnot. And that's kind of the approach I'm going in with The Chosen Ones as well as Killing Theodore. But Killing Theodore is more or less about a millennial perspective of this, and also talking about a lot of the lies and discrepancies and false narratives that have been told time and time again. And they were regenerated for a new generation in the past few years. So we have been doing a lot of research on that and speaking with individuals who have more information about those prior cases, and specifically on remains of known victims. I will go on record and say there are remains out there of known victims that are sitting in medical examiners offices that have not been tested.
Wow.
So, there's conversation. These families today, even though, the parents may have passed on, but they're still siblings, there's still children, these women and children. That's something that doesn't get talked about, is that Ted Bundy did murder children, not just Kimberly Leach. There was one more and potentially more, and was a pedophile. That's something that doesn't get talked about, as well as the glamorization of serial killers. That is one that has been the most horrific thing in my research, and really this underground fandom circulating around Ted Bundy. And it has now escalated to mass shooters, specifically, starting with the Columbine murderers all the way through Dylan Roof. There's merchandise with these shooters' faces on t-shirts, sweatshirts, you name it, it's there. And obviously during the time of Bundy, there were, fangirls, or but the term is hybristophilia, the women who are attracted to these type of serial predators. And so really my series there is going into that and the nuances about the Ted Bundy case, and what we've learned from it, what our individuals, have to say about, what they see today, how they perceive that, what has been, portrayed in the media, what's wrong, what's right. Let's go through it. So a lot of people, will say to me, well, why am I going to watch another one? And I said, because you haven't watched the right one, and you're just getting the story over and over again. I'm asking questions. I'm going through the research and, really trying to look at this discourse and dissect it. So, but in comparison, with the Vallow case, I think it's going to be a case that's going to, be pretty timely, and it will probably stick around. So jumping on this now, I don't even know what I'm getting myself into. I'll just be honest.
Right.
Already I'm just like, wow, this is a lot. For example, I was speaking with someone close to the family morning of the kids being found, and we were texting, and we both got that information kind of around while texting with someone. In that moment was a whole other level of, this is not rule book yet. This isn't, a Lifetime TV movie. These are people who are, living it right now. And how do I support them? I think that's very much the difference. And I want to be very respectful to the families. And I can't imagine what they're feeling right now. And it's honestly painful.
Yeah, that's such a good point. And I think you're such a great person to do this for that reason. And just speaking about some of the Ted Bundy movies and documentaries that have been made in the past, you're right. Like, I was shocked to find out that as many years as I've been into true crime, I didn't know he was a pedophile until I read The Phantom Prince and heard Molly's story. And it's like, why weren't we hearing this? Because I already think he's a bastard. But that just made him so much worse to me. Like, I can't even look at his face. Like, I can't look at pictures anymore after hearing that. Like, it's just so disgusting.
Exactly.
So I think that the way you're telling these stories is so much more transparent, and we have to stop making movies that make Ted Bundy look freaking cool and Lori Vallow look cool. Like, they're awful people.
Yeah.
So
exactly.
I'm really looking forward to seeing your documentary. And on that note, do you have some sort of estimate? I know that right now you're on hold with quarantine, but any sort of, idea of when it could be out?
We, on top of quarantine, we also, as I mentioned, we're following a lot of these cold cases and following up with certain police departments. I was tipped off not too long ago that another PD just recently reopened a case. So I've always said I don't want to rush this project because we were in post-production at one point last year, and then I was like, no, we've got to stop. I just got new information. And that's kind of, where we are at. So ultimately, I would really hope within the next year and a half, 2 years. But I just want to make sure it is a project that I'm proud of, and that I do justice for these families, as well as the victims and survivors who are near and dear to my heart.
Right. Well, I will definitely be keeping an eye out for that. I can't wait to watch it. I know you are going to do such a good job of giving all of the survivors and victims and their families the time and attention they need. So I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you.
Well, Celene, it's been an absolute pleasure having you here today. Can you let our viewers know where they can find you on social media?
Absolutely. So if you want to follow us for The Chosen Ones, we are on Facebook and Instagram at The Chosen Ones Podcast, or you can find us on Twitter at The Chosen One Pod. You can also check us out for Killing Theodore, same handle for Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And if you just want to follow me and get some fun facts and tidbits through both of these cases, you can follow me at Celene Beth on Instagram and Twitter.
And don't forget to subscribe to The Chosen Ones wherever you listen to podcasts so you don't miss a single episode.
This week on MurderMurder.NEWS, Kelly Silver reviews the book Mysterious Skin. The book, which was adapted to a movie starring Joseph Gordon-Levitt in 2004, is a coming-of-age story of 3 boys, which involves a potential alien abduction and the processing of childhood sexual abuse. We learn how each of these characters' stories is intertwined, what they know about each other, and what they come to learn about themselves. We see firsthand the incredible lengths our minds can go to in order to protect us from the truth of our darkest moments. Check out Kelly's review on MurderMurder.NEWS and be sure to check out Mysterious Skin.
We have a big announcement to make. We've officially launched MURDERMURDER.NEWS, and we are ready to get this true crime cult going. To celebrate our launch, we have a giveaway complete with a big goodie basket full of murder merch. We've got a MURDERMURDER.NEWS t-shirt, a tote bag, a safety whistle, postcards, and some swag from our favorite podcasts. To sign up for the giveaway and to help keep the true crime news coming, sign up at MURDERMURDER.NEWS or click the link down below. We can't wait to braid your hair and get you that baby goat and to hear about the serial killer case that you inappropriately lead with at parties.
We love reading your comments, so long as you're not an incel troll, and we would like to thank Calene for watching and for mentioning that she was shocked at how Dr. Death used gas stations to cover up his kidney harvesting.
We would also like to thank Cold Brew Barbie for commenting that she loves that we have featured so many military stories and that she's excited to check out the Military Murder Podcast. It's so good, definitely check it out.
Thanks so much for tuning into This Week in True Crime with Murder Murder News. If you haven't already, hit the subscribe button below, give us a thumbs up, and tell all of your true crime friends.
If you just can't get enough true crime, join a commune at MURDERMURDER.NEWS for our Monster Book Club and cold case solving groups. And don't forget to follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. See you next week.
Bye.